Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
And welcome. Hope you had some good food here. We still got a little, if you want, seconds after I'm done talking.
Mr. Clinton first.
Oh, you're going to call him out in front of everybody first time? Are we doing that now? We're that kind of church?
We have two other first timers.
Yeah, if you are. Usually, see, I don't call people out on their first time because it's very embarrassing for them. So, but these folks here obviously don't share that sentiment, so they're just content and embarrassing. So, welcome. If this is your first time, we've been going through the book of Genesis. We're more than halfway through now. We're in chapter 26. And Genesis is the book of the Bible that gives us the story of Israel's history, their founding, their family history in a lot of ways, because before Israel was a nation, he was a person. And we met him in the last chapter when he was born, only his name wasn't Israel at this point. And so this chapter, we're finishing up in chapter 26. We're going to look more at the life of Isaac. Isaac, of the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Isaac receives the least amount of attention in terms of texts that are about him specifically. Abraham had like 10, 12 chapters about him. Jacob's going to have the whole rest of the book about him. Isaac gets relatively little mention, but he is the next link in the chain of the promise that God made to Abraham. And that's what Genesis is really about. The promise God made to Abraham in chapter 12 was that he would do these things for Abraham, including give him many offspring and make his name great, and he would bless those who bless him, he would curse those who curse him. And the key, the culmination to the whole thing was through Abraham's what? Seed. Offspring. The word is seed, literally, but metaphorically it means offspring or descendants. All the nations of the earth would be blessed. And so the rest of Genesis traces that promise as it unfolds to each of his seed descendants, his offspring, and the line of the blessing as it carries forward. It's going to split each time. Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, and he had other sons as well. But the lines seem to split, but then the blessing goes through Isaac. And then Isaac, two sons, Jacob and Esau. And the line's going to go through Jacob. So we're tracing this promise, this carried forward blessing of the seed. And the purpose was to bless the whole world. The purpose was to bring the nations back to knowledge of God, which they had lost in Genesis 1 through 11 through their rebellion. So you have to keep that big picture in mind. Otherwise we get bogged down and Genesis turns into just a series of Bible stories. And Bible stories by themselves are not very useful because they're taken out of the context in which they're written and they become fables or moral lessons or little tales that you tell kids at bedtime. And that's not ever solely what they were intended for. They were told to children, but they were told as part of the big unfolding drama narrative. They weren't told in these little snippets, 30 minutes with talking vegetables. They were told through the history of the people of Israel as a whole. So that's what I harp on that each week because we have to keep it in mind. Otherwise, we end up losing track of where we are in Genesis. Genesis 26, the sons Jacob and Esau were born in the last chapter. We saw a little bit about their character. The last chapter ended by Esau despising his birthright, basically saying, I'm not worthy of heading up this household, which is what his birthright would have entailed. And so Jacob actually didn't deceive him. He just bought it from him. He said, you trade me your entire birthright and your future as the leader of our clan, and I'll give you a bowl of soup. And Esau did it because Esau was a knucklehead. We're going to see that at the end of this chapter as well. But now, 26, we jump back, and we're going to look at Isaac, more about him. Once again, this chapter is going to recapitulate a lot of Abraham's life. You're going to see the son is like the father in a lot of ways, intentional ways. This mirrors the events of Abraham's life in a number of settings that we've read already. So a lot of this is going to sound familiar. It sounds so familiar that some critical scholars will look at this and say, oh, well, the author is just retelling a story, and this is stitched together from another source that eventually, that was taking the previous section and just expanding it or making it up. They see this as it seems artificial to some scholars, but in reality, the author of Genesis, I think, is very intentionally showing through the events of Isaac's life that the promise that was given to Abraham and the character of Abraham in many ways is transferred and passed on to his son. There's a phrase like father, like son for a reason, because a lot of times we act in the ways of our parents. And that's what we're going to see here. Verse 1, chapter 26, there was a famine in the land. That should sound familiar because that's how Genesis 12 and Genesis 26 also talked about Abram leaving the land during a famine. Besides the earlier famine of Abraham's time, so again, he knows that happened in Abraham's time. This is a different one. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. That's where Abraham had gone in chapter 26. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and give them all these lands. And through your offspring, or seed, all nations on earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my requirements, my commands, my decrees, and my laws." So Isaac stayed in Gerar. Now, just this one paragraph is pretty interesting because the Lord appears to Isaac like he appeared to Abraham, and he tells him, don't go to Egypt, stay in this land, and if you do that, I'm going to bless you, I'm going to do these things. But he says, for to your descendants I will give all these lands. Now, before he had told to Abraham, I will give you this land. It was the land of Canaan. Now, Isaac is in the land of Gerar, which is slightly south of Canaan. And God is saying to Isaac, I will give you all these lands. The promise of the land has been expanded. And it'll go on in the Exodus. The promise of the land to the Israelites will be expanded from the river Euphrates to the river of Egypt. And then when we get to the New Testament, in Romans, Paul will be talking about Abraham, and he'll say, our father Abraham, to whom was promised the world. By the time of the New Testament, the promise of land becomes seen as by the apostle as the promise of the world. There's an expansion of God's blessing throughout the old and then into the new. But at this point, Isaac is getting the promise confirmed and expanded a little bit from what it was to Abraham. And then it says, through your offspring, all nations of the earth will be blessed. That's the key to the blessing. That's the point. That's the whole purpose. Because, look at the language in verse 5. Abraham obeyed me and kept my requirements, my commands, my decrees, and my laws. Now, we might just read over this and not think anything about it, but that phrase, my requirements, my demands, my decrees, my laws, that's a Deuteronomy phrase. If you read through to Deuteronomy, which a lot of Christians don't, but if you ever plow through and get there and actually do read it, that's a reoccurring phrase to speak of what Israel was supposed to do in keeping Torah, in keeping the law, in keeping the commandments. God would give them the law at Mount Sinai, Exodus 20, and then say, you are to keep these commandments, these statutes, these laws, these ordinances. He used these phrases over and over and over. This is Levitical language. But the law is still 400 years away. How is Abraham keeping God's requirements, decrees, commandments, laws, when that hasn't even been given yet? Well, the answer we'll see in the New Testament is what the New Testament authors pick up on, is that there's keeping God's commandments by the letter, and then there's keeping God's commandments by the heart, by your spirit, by a faithful, righteous life. God's laws and his decrees were given later, will be given later to the people of Israel to teach them and to show them and to command them how to live as God's people in God's land. And what they're reading when they read their account in Genesis and the history of their people is before that law was ever given, their forefather Abraham was already doing the law. He was already keeping Torah, even though it wasn't even given yet, because he was keeping the spirit of the law. He was walking faithfully with God. that's what Torah commandment was meant to give. It was to give people guidance on how to walk faithfully with God. And the New Testament authors will pick up on this as well. In Romans, Paul will say, Abraham was our forefather in faith. Before the law was ever given, Abraham was declared righteous. So righteousness doesn't come by keeping the law in the external sense. It doesn't come by living a life according to the commandments of Torah. It comes from walking with God in faith. And by doing the Torah, the Old Testament, Israel would have been doing that. Torah was their national way of life as a people that encapsulated what it meant to walk with God. Abraham was already doing it. So this is Torah language, this is covenant language, and it's really important, it's really key for how the New Testament develops theology of righteousness. And that you people in the Old Testament were righteous apart from keeping the law. They were righteous by walking with God and having a relationship. Even in the Old Testament, it was always about grace. It was always about faith. It was never about works. That's a later Protestant myth that Martin Luther and others popularized. But the Old Testament was as much about grace and faith as the New Testament ever could imagine. It's just, it looked different in a different setting. But God always required and demanded obedience from the heart, regardless of what your outward religious ceremonies looked like. The prophets were real big on that. So, Isaac stays in Gerar. Verse 7, when the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, she's my sister. Because he was afraid to say, she's my wife. He thought the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah because she is beautiful. And she would have been beautiful because the men are already asking about her. Hey, who's that? Guys, come on, we've all done it. What's her story? So, when Isaac had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down from a window and saw Isaac. What does your text say there? NIV says caressing. What does New King James say?
Showing endearment.
Showing what?
Endearment.
Showing endearment.
Showing endearment.
Okay. What?
Sporting.
Sporting. They playing tennis or something? What translation is that? King James, sporting. Yeah. So, caressing, sporting, showing endearment. The verb is Isaacing. It's the verb to laugh. It's the name, it's Isaac's name. That's the verb. And most of the time it means making fun of, or it was the verb that Ishmael was doing to Isaac back in previous chapters when Hagar and Sarah sent Hagar away because Ishmael was Isaacing Isaac. It's the same verb, but it has different meanings in different contexts, and so there's some question about what it means here. Some say it means playing with her, like in a way that brothers and sisters may not. Some say caressing has sort of a sexual connotation. Regardless of how you translate it, it's his name. It's Isaac. That's part of the wordplay in this chapter. Is Isaac was Isaacing his wife, and King Abimelech saw it, and whatever that entailed, he knew that's not what brothers and sisters do. And so he knew immediately, this is not what's going on here. So Abimelech summoned Isaac and said, she is really your wife. Why did you say she's my sister? Isaac answered him, because I thought I might lose my life on account of her. Then Abimelech said, what is this you've done to us? One of the men might have slept with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. So Abimelech gave orders to all the people. Anyone who molests this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. Anyone who touches either of them will be put to death. Now, this is the second time this has happened with an Abimelech. This happened with Abraham. Chapter 26. Abraham did the same thing. Was it the same king Abimelech? Probably not. The time that's passed, the amount of time is pretty great. We saw in that time Abimelech as a title, or could easily be a title or a family name like Pharaoh. And so there could have been different Abimelechs. If it was the son of Abimelech, he would have probably remembered the event that happened with this guy's dad and his dad previously. The wife's sister ruse was apparently common enough to realize at this time, at least for Abimelech. And again, we find, contrary to Isaac's view of the Philistines here, just like Abraham thought, well, if they see me with my beautiful wife, they're going to kill me. Isaac thought the same thing. And it turns out, lo and behold, these are, in this case, at least with Abimelech, he's a righteous pagan. In this sense, he's a pagan who knows right and wrong in terms of taking another man's Abraham's wife. There's a conscience that he has that's unexpected by Isaac, and maybe by the reader as well, because we're used to seeing all the people surrounding us as being either hostile or evil or ignorant of God's ways or whatever. And again, another little glimpse of the thing that's known as the righteous Gentile in the Old Testament. You get these glimpses that there are people outside of the promised people who have an understanding of God's law, who have an understanding of right and wrong, who act in ways that are unexpected, and they surprise the patriarchs. And in turn, it's the patriarchs who end up looking bad in this case. In this case, Isaac, he deceived this man. And he did it for, it turns out there was no reason to do so. There was no reason to fear that. If he had been honest with him, then it would have been fine. But because of his fear, he acted in deceit, just like Abraham had done. So the lives of these patriarchs aren't cut and dry lessons of this is how you should always act. Sometimes this is how you shouldn't act. And in this case, we get a sense Isaac's prejudice and his fear led him to make a really wrong assumption. And it really led him to dishonor his wife. I mean, telling everybody that this is your sister when it's not. He's not even, like Abraham was at least half true that she was his sister because she was his half-sister. But with Isaac, it's like his distant cousin. So he just flat out lies about it. And it's pointless. There's no need to, because Abimelech recognizes what's right and wrong and puts a decree out. Nobody touched either of these two. They are protected. They are under my protection. We're going to find out later he realizes they're under God's protection. Verse 12. So Isaac stays in the land. Isaac planted crops in the land, and the same year he reaped 100-fold because the Lord blessed him. The man became rich, and his wealth continued to grow until he became exceedingly wealthy. He had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. So all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the time of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up, filling them with earth. So why would they stop up wells? Well, if you don't have wells, you can't water your flocks, you can't water your crops. Your flocks and your crops diminish, therefore you're no longer so high and mighty. So this envy, this jealousy led to these people in the land, these other herders, these other shepherds, these other people, sabotaging, trying to bring him down. And that's just a human, that's a common human sinful response. You see somebody just blowing up and you want to bring them down. I mean, that's what TMZ bases their whole existence on that. Tabloids are in print because of that. You know, somebody's being blessed, you're going to tear them down. Somebody has more than you, knock them down a peg. And that's what experience is here, so they'd stop up all the wells. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, verse 16, move away from us, you've become too powerful for us. In other words, he's becoming more powerful than all the people in the region. He's getting too strong. So Isaac moved away from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham, which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham died, and he gave them the same names his father had given them. Isaac's servants dug in the valley and discovered a well of running water there, fresh water. It means like a spring. But the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen and said, that water's ours. So he named the well Esek, because they disputed with him, and that's the word for dispute. Then they dug another well, but they quarreled over that one also. So he named it Sitnah, which means opposition. Actually, Sitnah is a fun word. STN is the root, and it's the same root for Satan. It means to oppose or to come against or to accuse. So they opposed it a second time. They dug a well. No, you can't have that. That's ours too. And digging a well is not easy, by the way. It's not just you dig for a little bit. In the desert, this is pre any technology, not even shovels. So digging a well is a lot of hard work at this point. But he moved on, verse 22, moved on from there and dug another well. And no one quarreled over it. He named it Rehoboth, saying, now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land. And Rehoboth just means like wide open spaces or room. From there he went up to Beersheba. That night the Lord appeared to him, second time this chapter. The Lord appeared to him and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. Because the promise God made to Abraham, God's going to keep his promise. Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. That means to worship Yahweh. There he pitched his tent, and there his servants dug a well. Meanwhile, Abimelech had come to him from Gerar with Ahuzah, his personal advisor, and Phicol, the commander of his forces. Isaac asked them, "Why have you come to me, since you were hostile and sent me away?" They answered, "We've seen clearly that the Lord was with you." So he said, "There ought to be a sworn agreement between us and you. Let's make a treaty with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we did not touch you, but always treated you well and sent you away in peace. And now you are blessed by the Lord." So even Abimelech's recognizing the promise that God made to Abraham. Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. You will be a blessing. All of these promises, you're seeing it in this one condensed chapter, are coming true that God had made all the way back starting in Genesis 12. Isaac then made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. Early the next morning, the men swore an oath to each other. Maybe some thigh grabbing. We don't know yet. Too good for that. You know what it means. Then Isaac sent them on their way, and they left him in peace. That day, Isaac's servants came and told him about the well they dug. They said, "We found water," and they called it Shiva. To this day, the name of the town has been Beersheba. Pause here real quick before we end. This is a great section in terms of seeing the character of Isaac and the handling of the situation. His success brought opposition. That's going to happen. We see that in our lives today. He could have handled that opposition in a way of confrontation. He dug those wells. And then the people of the land said, "Hey, these are our wells." What did he do? Did he step up and say, "Don't you touch God's anointed. You know, I've got Yahweh on my side. Bring it on." He could have done that. He didn't do that. He moved and he dug another well. They came and they satanically opposed him, literally in the verb. And what did he do that time? Did he say, "I've already left one well. If you want this one, you got to fight me for it"? Did he demand his rights? No. He said, "Fine." He moved, went to another well. Third well, he finally was able to have that. So both times he refused to insist on his rights. He had a legal right. Some would say he had a moral right. His property was being endangered, his livelihood, his crops, feeding his family, all those things. But instead of that, and instead of opposing it and fighting back, he said, "You know what? God's promised that he's going to bless me, and it's not worth it." And he steps back and he goes, and each time God blesses him. And finally, when the king of these people who have been opposing him, who have been stealing his water, his wells, his hard work, taking over what was his, when the king comes to him and says, "We recognize God's with you. Let's make a peace treaty. Let's have peace." He could have said, No, we're not going to have peace until you give me those wells back. You wronged me in the past. I want my just deserts. He could have said that. He didn't. He makes peace with him. And on the day that he made peace, his servants come back and go, "We found another water supply." That's God's way. I think that's God's way of saying, blessed are the peacemakers, not blessed are the rights demanders. And that has implications for how we handle personal conflict. That has implications for how the world handles conflict. You know, that has implications for how peoples that feel wronged treat one another. If God is really backing you, then you don't need to keep a record of the wrongs done to you. You can just know that God's going to work it out. Yeah, I may lose some water in the meantime. I may lose a well here or there. But the peace that comes from that is going to be genuine. And that's going to be blessed by God more than these wells that I've dug myself would ever be blessed. And so I see a really important lesson and insight into this section that otherwise might seem like a random story about digging wells and moving around. I think there's something to that. And so you can read over and think on that and pray on it on your own and see how God applies it in your own life. But then the section ends, the chapter ends, just like the last chapter ended with Esau despising his birthright. This section ends with, when Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. They were a source of grief to Isaac and Rebekah. We end with this little, seemingly random glimpse into Esau's life. We were just talking about Isaac the whole time. Now it's going to talk about his firstborn son Esau. Well, we've already seen that Esau despised his birthright enough to sell it for soup. Now he takes not just one wife, but two. And he doesn't take wives from his people, he takes wives of the Hittites, which Abraham had specifically sent his servant to get Isaac a wife, not among the Hittites. They were not supposed to marry among the Hittites. Esau does it. He does it twice. again, Esau's a knucklehead. So when we see in the next chapter, when he loses his blessing, we realize that in the providence of God, Esau was not fit to have that blessing to begin with. That doesn't excuse Jacob or Rebekah from how they're going to get it. It doesn't take them off the hook. But it does show that the character of Jacob and the character of Esau, and shows that Esau is not going to be the one who is fit to carry on the identity of the people, or his family, his clan, his tribe. So in this chapter, Esau embitters his mom. In the next chapter, she's going to embitter him pretty badly. So we're already going to see this kind of dysfunctional family dynamic at work. And wherever in the Old Testament never flat out condemns polygamy. I mean, it doesn't come out and say, you shall not take two wives. It doesn't. That's just something we have to realize. But what it does do is every time you see polygamy in the Old Testament, you see an unhappy family as a result. And you see a whole lot of drama and a whole lot of negativity, and it's just never a good thing. So the Old Testament doesn't condemn it, but it never condones it, and it actually shows that it is destructive to family unity. And that's what we'll see in the whole rest of the book, actually, the whole rest of Genesis. So we're done for the day. If you want to get caught up on this study, by the way, you'll notice there's a camera there. I record these. I put them on my website every week, so you can catch up, jmsmith.org/blog. That's it. Have a great week. We'll see you next week. There's still some food up here if anybody wants to try it.